The world stage is often filled with complex dramas, and today's story involves oil, immigration, and international pressure. Welcome to Story-Driven English. We're going to be looking at the United States' decision to place tariffs on oil imported from Venezuela. This move is aimed at pushing the Venezuelan government to address issues of immigration and crime that are impacting the U.S. Let's unpack this story and learn some key English vocabulary and phrases. The Great Oil Tax Telenovela, Trump versus Macaroons, Upon a Time in the Land of Stars, Stripes, and Fast Food. The United States, under the golden-haired reign of Donald Trump, decided to stir the pot with its southern neighbor, Venezuela. The year was somewhere in the late 2010s, and the White House had a new script: slap a hefty tax on Venezuelan oil imports. Officially, the reason was as noble as a superhero movie plot: pressure Maduro's government over immigration, chaos, and crime spilling over borders, threatening the good old US of A. But like any good telenovela, the real story had more twists, a splash of politics, and a dash of international shade. Throwing. Back in the day, the US and Venezuela were like buddies, sharing a milkshake with two straws. Venezuela pumped out oil like it was auditioning for OPEC's MVP, and the US happily guzzled it down to keep its cars humming and its lights buzzing. But then enter Maduro, stage left, with a government that made the US squint and say, "Wait, is this guy for real?" By 2018, Trump and co. had stopped buying the Maduro as legit storyline, calling his election shadier than a palm tree in a hurricane. Democracy, human rights, economic smarts. The US gave Venezuela's report card a big fat F, and the bromance officially turned into a breakup. Now, Trump wasn't one to just send a strongly worded email and call it a day. Nope, he rolled out his favorite toy: tariffs, his America First playbook was basically a guide to flexing economic muscle. Think of it as the US flashing its wallet like a bouncer at a club, saying, "You're not on the list." Tariffs weren't new. They'd been slapped on everything from Chinese gadgets to Canadian lumber. So when Venezuela's oil got the tax treatment, it wasn't exactly a plot twist. It was more like the next episode in Trump's tariff reality show. The official line: "Maduro's letting criminals and migrants flood our borders." Cue dramatic music. Sure, Venezuela was a mess: hyperinflation so wild you needed a wheelbarrow of cash for a coffee, and crime stats that made action movies look tame. People were fleeing faster than you could say passport stamp, and some were indeed heading north. But here's the funny part. The US border wasn't exactly swarming with Venezuelan desperados. Most were chilling in Colombia or Peru, sipping cheaper coffee and dodging the chaos back home. So, was this oil tax really about immigration and crime? Or was it Trump playing chess while Maduro was still figuring out checkers? Dig a little deeper, and the story gets juicier. Word on the street, or at least in think tank corridors, was that Trump's tariff tantrum was less about border security and more about giving Maduro a geopolitical wedgie. Venezuela's oil was a lifeline, and not just for them. China, a big player in the "let's annoy the US" club, was cozying up to Caracas. By taxing the oil, Trump wasn't just squeezing Maduro. He was winking at Beijing, saying, "I see you, and I raise you a tariff." It was like a global game of Monopoly, but with oil barrels instead of hotels. So, did it work? Well, the jury's still out, sipping coffee and debating. Immigration didn't exactly screech to a halt. People kept leaving Venezuela because, frankly, staying wasn't a picnic crime. Still a thing. Maduro, still there, probably shaking his fist at the sky. Meanwhile, Venezuela fired back with some choice words, and the international community chimed in with a chorus of, "Really, America?" Some countries tut-tutted, others shrugged, and the UN probably scheduled another meeting to talk about it. In the end, the great oil tax saga of Trump versus Maduro was less a clean victory and more a messy comedy of errors. The US flexed Venezuela, fumed, and the world watched like it was binging a Netflix special. One thing's for sure: it gave everyone something to gossip about over their overpriced lattes. And somewhere, a barrel of oil sat quietly, wondering why it had to be the star of this drama. The tariff twist. Trump's oil tax goes global just when you thought the Trump versus Maduro telenovela couldn't get any spicier. The plot thickened. On March 24, 2025, yesterday, if you're keeping track, Donald Trump strutted to the podium, hair as defiant as ever, and dropped a bombshell. With a flourish of his pen, he signed an executive order that was less a slap on Venezuela's wrist and more a global game of economic whack-a-mole. Starting April 2, 2025, any country daring to sip from Venezuela's oily cup, whether directly or through some sneaky third-party straw, would face a 25% tariff. On their goods heading to the USQ, the gasps from the International Peanut Gallery. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill tariff. Trump called it a secondary tariff, which is fancy talk for, I'm not just mad at you, Venezuela, I'm side-eyeing your friends, too. The idea was simple. If you're buying Maduro's oil, your exports to the U.S. are about to get a lot pricier. And here's the kicker, it wouldn't stop until a year after you kicked the Venezuelan oil habit. Or sooner, if some White House suits decided you'd learned your lesson. It was like grounding your teenager, but also docking their allowance until they dumped their shady boyfriend. Now, this wasn't Trump's first rodeo with creative punishment. Back in the day, he'd tossed secondary sanctions at folks dealing with Iran or North Korea, so this oil tax twist felt like a page from his greatest hits. But targeting oil trading nations instead of just Venezuela, that was next-level chess, or maybe checkers with extra flair. The U.S. wasn't content with just squeezing Maduro anymore. They wanted the whole neighborhood to feel the pinch. Picture Trump leaning back in the Oval Office, smirking. If I can't have the oil, nobody can, or at least, not without paying my toll. Why the escalation? Well, Venezuela's oil wasn't just keeping Maduro's lights on, it was greasing the wheels for pals like China and Russia, who'd been happily buying up barrels while the U.S. watched from the sidelines. By taxing anyone who dared join the oil party, Trump was sending a message. Step away from the pump, or your widgets and gadgets are going to cost you. It was less about immigration and crime. Now those old excuses were starting to sound like a broken record, and more about flexing on the global stage. Maduro might have been the target, but the ripple effect was aimed at Beijing and Moscow. With a cheeky checkmate vibe, of course, the world didn't just nod and say, cool plan, bro. Venezuela, predictably, threw a fit. Maduro, probably, called it imperialist nonsense. While waving a fistful of that couldn't buy a sandwich. Other countries scratched their heads, wondering if they'd accidentally stepped into a trade war soap opera. Oil markets twitched, analysts scribbled frantic notes, and somewhere in a European cafe, a diplomat muttered, I need a stronger espresso for this. The tariff wouldn't even hit until next week, but the buzz was already deafening. Did it work? Too early to tell. March 25, 2025 is barely a day into this saga, but one thing's for sure. Trump had turned the oil tax drama into a full-on international cliffhanger. Would nations ditch Venezuelan crude to dodge the tariff? Would Maduro find new buyers in the shadows? Or would this all blow over like a bad reality TV season? Grab your popcorn or maybe a barrel of oil and stay tuned. The blame game. Trump points fingers and tariffs as the tariff tale rolled on. Donald Trump wasn't about to let the spotlight dim. On March 24, 2025, fresh off signing his oil taxing executive order, he took to his digital megaphone Truth Social and unleashed a classic Trumpism. Venezuela, he typed, probably with a dramatic squint, is deliberately and sneakily sending us their worst criminals, gangsters, you name it. He zeroed in on the Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan gang that sounded like it could star in its own gritty crime flick. In speeches that week, he doubled down, painting a picture of Maduro twirling his mustache figuratively. Of course, while unleashing chaos across the U.S. border, it was peak reality TV energy, and the White House wasn't about to let the script flop. The official paperwork, the White House fact sheet, and that shiny new executive order backed him up with all the gravitas of a government press release. The mission: protect America's national security from the emergency. The docs name-dropped Tren de Aragua again, calling it a transnational crime threat that Maduro had practically invited to brunch by leaving Venezuela's borders as wide open as a 24-hour diner. The accusation was juicy. Just failing to stop these gangsters, he was letting them thrive, maybe even giving them a hi-fi on their way to the U.S., the cherry on top. This tariff would starve Maduro's cash flow, cutting off the funds he allegedly used to keep his regime humming and his pals high. China and Russia happy. Enter Marco Rubio, Trump's newly minted Secretary of State, striding onto the scene like a cowboy in a diplomatic showdown. "We're not playing nice," Rubio declared, wagging a finger at any third-party countries sipping Venezuelan oil. "If you're cozying up to Maduro's corrupt clown show, you're on our naughty list." The message was clear. This wasn't just about gangbangers. It was about sticking it to a government the U.S. saw as a geopolitical thorn, tangled up with America's rivals: immigration, crime, and a sprinkle of global power plays. It was a 3-4-1 deal, wrapped up in a shiny tariff bow. But let's zoom in on this Tren de Agua crew for a sec. Hailing from Venezuela's roof-and-tumble streets, they'd made a name for themselves in extortion, drugs, and general mayhem. Think of them as the bad boys of the barrio. By 2025, they'd reportedly spread their wings, popping up in places like Colombia and Peru, where Venezuelan migrants were already piling up. Trump's team swore they were sneaking into the U.S., too, turning border towns into their personal playground. Was it true? Well, the stats were fuzzier than a peach in a blender. Most Venezuelan migrants were still crashing closer to home, not trekking to Texas. Still, Tren de Aragua had a ring to it, and Trump wasn't about to let a good villain go to waste. So, the tariff became Trump's Swiss Army knife, a tool to fight crime, curb immigration, and kneecap Maduro's wallet, all while flexing at nations daring to defy the America First gospel. Did it add up? Maybe if you squinted hard enough. Critics whispered that the gang scare was more sizzle than steak, and the real goal was still that geopolitical wedgie we mentioned last time. Maduro, meanwhile, probably scoffed into his coffee, muttering about gringo lies, while his oil barrels gathered dust. The world watched, half amused, half baffled, as Trump tied his tariff to everything from border boogeyman to global chess moves. Whether it'd stop a single gangster or just make oil pricier remained anyone's guess. One thing was certain: this saga was serving drama hotter than a Caracas summer day, and the next episode, set to drop April 2nd, was already trending. Behind the curtain, Trump's tariff tango gets politicalis. The oil tariff drama unfolded. It started to feel less like a random outburst and more like a carefully choreographed dance, complete with political pirouettes and a wink to the audience. Sure, Trump was hollering about Venezuelan gangsters and border chaos, but peel back the curtain and you'd spot some sneaky motives twirling in the spotlight. This wasn't just about Maduro or his oily empire. It was about strutting for the home crowd and maybe even jingling a few extra coins into Uncle Sam's pockets. At home, Trump's base, those red cap-wearing, build the wall, chanting superfans, were still the apple of his eye in 2025. Immigration and border security had been their jam since day one, and the man knew how to play a hit single. By tying the tariff to wild tales of Tren de Aragua goons sneaking across the border, Trump was tossing red meat to his loyalists. "See," he seemed to say, puffing out his chest, "I'm keeping the bad guys out bigly. Never mind that most Venezuelan migrants were still kicking it in Lima, not knocking on Texas' door." The image of a toughened crime, toughened borders Trump was gold for the rally circuit, and this tariff was the shiny prop he needed to sell it. Picture it: a packed arena, flags waving, and Trump booming, "Venezuela's sending us their worst. But I've got the fix, a 25% tariff smackdown." The crowd roars, the tweets fly, and suddenly, every voter worried about a gangbanger hiding in their bushes is nodding along. It didn't matter if the numbers were more hype than fact. Perception was the game, and Trump was the MVP. Plus, with midterms or some election always lurking around the corner, it's America. After all, this was a chance to remind his crew he hadn't gone soft. But wait, there's more. Beyond the applause, some bean counters in D.C., Mitov spotted a bonus perk: cash. Tariffs aren't just sticks to whack foreign foes, they're also little moneymakers. Slap a 25% tax on goods from countries buying Venezuelan oil, and suddenly the U.S. Treasury's got a fatter wallet. Sure, it wasn't going to fund a moon base or anything, but in a world of budget squabbles, every penny counts. Was this the main goal? Probably not. Trump wasn't exactly whispering revenue stream in his truth. Social rants, but it's hard to believe his team didn't notice the side hustle. Call it a happy accident, like finding a 20 in your old jeans. So while the tariff looked like a fist aimed at Maduro's nose, it was also a flex for the folks back home. A 2-for-1 deal. rally the base with a tough guy stance, and maybe sneak some extra bucks into the piggy bank. Political genius, or just Trump being Trump. Either way, it kept the saga spinning, with the April 2nd kickoff date looming like the season finale everyone's buzzing about. Would it stop crime, boost the budget, or just make for great campaign slogans? The plot, as always, was thickening, and the popcorn was still popping. The global gambit Trump's tariff takes on the world, while Trump was busy wowing the home crowd with his tariff theatrics. The real chess game was happening on the international board. This oil tax wasn't just a domestic flex, it was a full-on foreign policy power move. With Maduro's Venezuela as the piñata and a few global heavyweights in the crosshairs, think of it as Trump twirling a lasso, aiming to rope in more than just one unruly neighbor. First up, maximum pressure on Maduro. Venezuela's oil wasn't just a side gig, was the lifeblood of his regime, the cash that kept the lights flickering in Caracas when they weren't blacked out anyway. By taxing anyone daring to buy it, Trump was basically trying to drain Maduro's piggy bank dry. The hope, squeezed hard enough, and maybe Venezuela's political scene would crack open like a piñata at a kid's party, spilling out change the U.S. could cheer for. It wasn't a new playbook. America had been tossing sanctions at Maduro for years, but this tariff twist turned the heat up to 11. If Maduro wouldn't budge, at least he'd be broker, so the theory went. But here's where it gets spicy. The tariff wasn't just eyeballing Venezuela, it was sneaking a peek at China, too. The Middle Kingdom had been slurping up Venezuelan crude like it was bubble tea, especially after U.S. sanctions left more barrels on the table. By 2025, China was one of Maduro's VIP customers, and Trump wasn't thrilled about it. This wasn't just about oil, it was a chapter in the bigger U.S.-China showdown, where trade spats and geopolitical flexing were the name of the game. Taxing countries buying Venezuelan oil was like Trump sliding a note across the table. Hey, Beijing, keep cozying up to my foes, and your exports might hit a 25% speed bump. Subtle, nope, effective. We'd find out after April 2nd. And then, there's the long game. This secondary tariff, trick punishing third parties for dancing with the wrong partner, could set a shiny new precedent. Imagine Trump grinning in the Oval Office, thinking, why stop at Venezuela? If it worked, the U.S. could dust off this playbook for any regime. It didn't like Iran, North Korea, you name it. It was less about the oil itself and more about sending a memo to the world, play with our enemies, and your shipping invoices are going to sting. A global timeout corner enforced by the almighty dollar. So, from the foreign policy lens, this tariff was a multitasking marvel. Choke Maduro's cash, poke China in the ribs, and lay down a marker for future foes. Isolation was the vibe make. Venezuela, a lonely kid at the lunch table, and maybe nudge its buddies to rethink their RSVPs, did it ruffle feathers? Oh, you bet. China probably grumbled into its tea, Maduro cursed in Spanish, and the rest of the world scribbled notes for the next UN gripe session, whether it'd topple a government, tweak a superpower, or just make oil markets sweat. Was anyone's guess, but one thing was clear. Trump's tariff tango had gone global, and the dance floor was getting crowded. The Venezuelan exodus, why they're fleeing, and where they're landing be now. Our Trump tariff telenovela has painted a vivid picture. Oil taxes, gangsters, and global power plays. But let's rewind the tape and zoom in on why this whole mess started spinning in the first place. Spoiler alert, it's not because Venezuelans suddenly decided they wanted to trade arepas for apple pie. Nope, the real story is a grim cocktail of economic meltdown, political mayhem, and a humanitarian crisis that sent folks running for the hills or, more accurately, the U.S. border. Picture Venezuela, circa 2010. Once an oil-rich kid on the block, now a cautionary tale, the numbers tell it best. Back then, about 200,000 Venezuelans called the U.S. home, according to estimates. Fast forward to 2023, and that figure's ballooned to a whopping 770,000. What happened? Well, imagine hyperinflation so wild your paycheck can't buy a loaf of bread. Grocery shelves emptier than a ghost town, and a government that's less for the people and more against anyone who disagrees. Add a sprinkle of repression and a dash of hunger. And you've got the recipe for the biggest migration wave the Americas have ever seen. By 2025, over 7.7 million Venezuelans had ditched their homeland since 2015, and a chunky slice of them aimed for the stars and stripes. The U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP folks, can vouch for the surge. In fiscal year 2021, 49,000 Venezuelans at the U.S.-Mexico border already a jump from the trickle of years past. By 2022, that number rocketed to 188,000, and in 2023, it hit 266,000, even with a slight dip to 261,000. In 2024, thanks to tighter controls in Panama and Mexico, it's clear this isn't a one-season storyline. These aren't just stats, they're people trekking through jungles like the Gap, dodging snakes and smugglers, all to chase a shot at something better. Why? Because back home, the S worth less than monopoly money, and the only thing thriving is chaos. So who are these border? Mostly young, educated types, think engineers, and teachers who'd rather flip burgers in Miami than starve in Maracaibo. Florida and Texas have turned into Venezuelan hotspots, with about half of them bunking in the Sunshine State alone. The U.S. has rolled out the welcome mat, sort of, with temporary protected status, TPS, a legal lifeline that says, you can stay and work, just don't get comfy forever. By early 2025, around 607,000 Venezuelans had snagged TPS, up from 242,700 in 2021. There's also a humanitarian parole program letting some fly in legally, though Trump's team axed parts of that on day one of his 2025 comeback. Still, these folks hustle labor force participations high-butt their wallets. Not so much. Poverty's a stubborn shadow, and their median income lags behind locals and other immigrants. Back to the why of it all, Venezuela's a textbook train wreck, economic collapse, think 1,000,000% inflation at its peak, political thuggery. Maduro's not winning any Democrat of the Year awards, and a humanitarian mess, no food, no meds, no hope. Crimes. The cherry on top gangs like Tren de Aragua aren't just a Trump talking point. They're real, born in Venezuela's lawless prisons, and now flexing muscle across borders. It's no wonder people are bailing. For many, the U.S. isn't just a dream, it's survival. So when Trump slapped that tariff on Venezuelan oil buyers, it wasn't just about flexing on Maduro or poking China. It was a ripple in a much bigger Weeva migration, flood-driven by desperation. Did it slow the tide? Not really. People kept coming, tariff or not, because staying put wasn't an option. The saga's far from over, and with April 2nd, 2025, just days away. The world's still watching to see if this tax trick changes the plot or just adds more drama to an already wild ride. Crime, time in Venezuela, migrants, and a Trump twist of Venezuela's migration wave was the tearjerker subplot of our tariff telenovela. The crime angle was the action-packed spin-off, complete with villains, accusations, and a dash of controversy. By 2025, Venezuela wasn't just a poster child for economic collapse. It was a crime hotspot so wild it could have starred in its own gritty Netflix series. Murder, kidnapping, extortion, you name it, they had it. Turbocharged by political chaos, a tanked economy, and corruption so thick you could spread it on toast. But here's the twist. Even with all that mayhem, the murder rate had actually dipped in recent years. Why? Well, when half the country's bolted for the exits, there's fewer folks left to fight over the last scraps. Enter the real star of Trump's crime narrative, Tren de Aragua. Born in the steamy chaos of a Venezuelan prison, this gang wasn't content with local fame. They'd gone international, spreading their wings like a budget crime syndicate with dreams of the big leagues. By 2025, they were popping up everywhere: Colombia, Peru, even the U.S. running a buffet of bad behavior, human trafficking, drug smuggling, extortion, and the kind of violence that makes action movies blush. Their favorite targets, vulnerable Venezuelan migrants, easy pickings in a world of desperation. Trump seized on this like a kid spotting candy, bellowing on Truth Social that Maduro was practically stuffing these gangsters into suitcases and shipping them to America. Deliberate and sneaky, he roared, and the White House nodded along. Was there truth to the tale? Sort of, but with a big asterisk. Yes, Tren de Aragua had made it to the U.S. Think Small cruise in cities like Chicago or Miami, stirring up trouble with drug busts or shakedowns. Cops had nabbed a handful of Venezuelan migrants tied to petty crimes or gang scraps, and the headlines loved it. But here's the kicker. Study after study, the boring, number-crunching kind, showed immigrants, Venezuelans included, weren't. The crime wave Trump painted them as, in fact, they were less likely to break the law than your average born-and-bred American. Turns out, schlepping through jungles to flip burgers doesn't leave much time for a gangster side gig. Still, facts never stopped a good story, and Trump's team ran with it. Tren de Aragua, poster boys and all to hammer it home. The administration dusted off the alien enemy's Actan oldie from 1798. Last seen in World War II, reruns started fast-tracking deep. No trials, no fuss. If you were tagged as a gangbanger, out you went. Cue the uproar. Civil rights folks cried foul, lawyers waved constitutions, and critics smirked. This isn't justice, it's a reality show eviction. Trump shrugged it off, tariff in one hand, deportation pen in the other, insisting Maduro's crime exports justified it all. Meanwhile, back in Venezuela, the streets stayed rough. Gangs like Tren de Aragua thrived in the vacuum. But the mass exodus meant their playground was shrinking. So, did Venezuela's crime spree really flood the U.S. with chaos? Not quite. Of it stayed south of the border, tangled up in the migrant trail. Trump's tariff might have been allowed no thanks to Maduro's mess. But linking it to American crime felt more like a scriptwriter stretching for a cliffhanger. As April 2, 2025, crept closer, the saga churned on less about stopping gangsters, more about political points and oil barrel brinkmanship, the real crime. Maybe it was the popcorn running out before the next twist. The oil squeeze. Will Trump's tariff tip Venezuela over the edge? As our tariff telenovela barrels toward its April 2, 2025 premiere, it's time to peek at the fallout tour. More accurately, the potential faceplant awaiting Venezuela. Trump's big idea to tax countries buying Venezuelan oil wasn't just a geopolitical jab. It was an economic gut punch aimed at a nation already wheezing on the ropes. Picture Venezuela as a one-trick pony, with oil as its golden ticket. It's been the backbone of their economy since forever, accounting for over 90% of export cash in its heyday. So, when Trump waved his tariff wand, the stakes weren't just high, they were skyscraper-level. By 2025, Venezuela's economy was already a master class in how low can you go. Hyperinflation had turned thee into confetti oil. Production had tanked from 3 million barrels a day in the early 2000s to a measly 700,000 or so, and sanctions had shrunk their customer list to a handful of loyalists like China and India. Now, with Trump's tax looming, anyone still buying Venezuelan crude might think twice why. Risk a 25% hit on their own exports to the U.S. just for some discounted oil. If buyers bail, that's less cash flowing into Caracas, and for a government that's been juggling bills like a circus clown, that's bad news. We're talking less money for basics like food subsidies, already scarce. Medicine, good luck finding any, or even keeping the lights on. Blackouts were practically a national pastime by now. Maduro's regime might feel the squeeze hardest. Oil revenue isn't just their piggy bank, it's their lifeline, funding everything from loyal cronies to the military that keeps them in power. Cut that off, and you've got a recipe for a grumpy government scrambling to patch holes in a sinking ship. For regular Venezuelans, though, it's less tighten your belts and more what belts. They've been scraping by for years, bartering for eggs or fleeing the country altogether. A tariff-driven downturn could crank that misery dial from awful to apocalyptic, pushing even more folks toward the border trails Trump's so fired up about. But here's the $1 million or million, if they're still counting. Question: will it actually work? Economically, sure, it could kneecap Venezuela. Further, think of it as kicking someone who's already down, then taking their crutches. Politically, though, that's where the plot twists. Maduro's hung on through worse sanctions, protests, you name it, partly by leaning on pals like Russia and China, who might just shrug and keep buying oil on the cheap. If they do, the tariffs bite might sting less than Trump hopes. Plus, Venezuela's already a pro at dodging sanctions with shadowy oil swaps, and middlemen think of it as their unofficial national sport. So, as the tariff clock ticks down, Venezuela braces for impact. Trump's betting this oil squeeze will make Maduro squirm, maybe even spark that regime change he's been dreaming of. But in a country where rock bottom is a moving target, it might just mean more of the same, a government limping along, a people pushed to the brink, and an economy that's one step from starring in a disaster flick. Stay tuned, Burl Seconds, coming. And this saga's about to get oil, i.e. the ripple effect. Trump's tariff tickles the U.S. and beyond with Venezuela. Soil lifeline dangling by a thread thanks to Trump's tariff tantrum, the shockwaves weren't about to stop at Caracas. Nope, this was a splash that could wet the shoes of the U.S. itself, not to mention big oil guzzlers like China and India. As the April 2, 2025 deadline loomed, the world braced for a game of economic domino. Some might topple, others might. It's just wobble, but everyone was bound to feel the breeze. Let's start with the U.S. Sure. Trump's crew wasn't buying much Venezuelan crude anymore. Sanctions had slashed that trade years ago, but oil's a global dance floor, and when one partner trips, everyone stumbles. If countries like China or India ditch Venezuelan oil to dodge the 25% tariff on their exports, that's less crude sloshing around the market. Supply dips, prices twitch, and suddenly, American refineries, especially those Gulf Coast champs, who once loved Venezuela's heavy oil, might need to scout for pricier substitutes. Canada? Saudi Arabia? Sure, they've got barrels. But switching suppliers isn't like swapping Netflix shows. Logistics cost money, and guess who picks up the tab? Yep, U.S. consumers. Gas pumps could creep higher, grocery bills might sneak up thanks, shipping costs, and businesses could grumble about tighter margins. Trump might have aimed this arrow at Maduro, but a ricochet could nick American wallets. Then there's the international VIPs, China and India. Oil-thirsty giants who've been sipping Venezuelan crude on the down low. China's been a top buyer, scooping up around 300,000 barrels a day in recent years, often via sneaky third-party deals to skirt U.S. sanctions. India's no slouch either, grabbing discounted Venezuelan oil when the price is right. Now, with Trump's tariff dangling like a pay-up or else sign, both face a pickle. Keep buying from Maduro and their exports to the U.S. Think electronics from China or pharma from India get slapped with that 25% tax. Ditch Venezuela, and they're scrambling for new oil sources, likely at a premium. Either way, it's a headache. Higher costs, annoyed consumers. Or a diplomatic dance to keep the oil flowing without ticking off Uncle Sam. Will they blink? China might not. Beijing's got a stubborn streak and a knack for playing the long game. Plus, they love sticking it to the U.S. when they can. They could lean harder into Russia or Iran, though that's its own geopolitical soap opera. India's trickier. They're less keen on poking the bear and might quietly shift suppliers, maybe cozying up to the Middle East instead. Either way, the global oil shuffle could nudge prices up everywhere, making this tariff less a surgical strike and more a splashy cannonball. So, while Trump's betting this tax kneecaps Venezuela, the blowback's real. U.S. drivers might curse at the pump. Chinese factories might sweat their margins, and India might rethink its oil shopping list, all while Maduro's still limping alone. It's classic Trump. Big swing, loud noise, messy splash. As April 2nd nears, the world's watching to see who's left dripping and who's just toweling off with a smirk. The migration puzzle: can Trump's tariff stop the exodus? As Trump's oil tariff plotline barrels toward its April 2nd, 2025 debut, one big question keeps popping up like a pesky cliffhanger. Will it actually keep Venezuelans from trekking to the U.S.? Spoiler alert, the jury's out, and it's looking more like a coin toss than a slam dunk. This isn't a whodunit. With a tidy ending, think of it as a what's the point episode that's got everyone scratching their heads. Let's rewind to why Venezuelans are bolting in the first place. It's not because they've got a sudden itch to see the Statue of Liberty or snag a selfie with the Texas Longhorn. Nope, it's the triple whammy back home. An economy so busted you need a suitcase of cash for a soda. A government that treats dissent like a piñata at a party. And a humanitarian crisis where food and meds are rarer than a unicorn sighting. By 2025, these are the VIPs of Venezuela's misery index, driving millions out the door. 266,000 nabbed at the U.S. border in 2023 alone, And that's just the ones who got caught. Trump's tariff might squeeze oil buyers, but does it fix any of that? Cue the skeptical squint. Here's the rub. Hitting Venezuela's oil cache could go either way or maybe nowhere at all. On one hand, some argue it'll make life even grimmer. Less money for Maduro means less for whatever scraps of services still exist, like subsidized bread or a flickering streetlight. If things get bleaker, more folks might pack their bags, figuring the gaps snakes are less scary than starvation. Studies on sanctions, like the USS earlier Venezuela, squeeze back this up. Economic pain often turbocharges migration, not the other way around. Think of it as kicking a beehive. Sure, you hurt the bees, but now they're buzzing everywhere. On the flip side, there's a case that oil money actually fuels the exodus. When Venezuela's flush with crude cash, some say it greases the wheels. For people to leave paying smugglers, bribing officials, or just scraping together bus fare to Colombia, cut that flow, and maybe fewer can afford the trip. It's a theory, but it's shaky. Most Venezuelans aren't exactly jetting off on oil-funded vacations. They're fleeing with whatever's in their pockets, often nothing. By 2025, the economy's so wrecked that oil revenue's more about keeping Maduro's cronies fed than bankrolling mass getaways. So where does that leave Trump's tariff? Smack in the middle of a big fat maybe? It's not tackling the root causes: hyperinflation, repression, empty shelves, because those are homegrown disasters, not oil buyer problems. If anything, it might just shuffle the deck, worsen the crisis, and push more out, or dry up funds and strand some at home. Either way, the border stats aren't budging yet. 261,000 crossings in 2024. Say desperation doesn't wait for tax policies. Trump might thump his chest about stopping the flood, but this tariff's more likely to tweak oil markets than rewrite the migration script, as April 2nd nears. The saga's still a head-scratcher. Will the tariff slow the Venezuelan tide? Doubtful. It's like mopping the floor during a hurricane. The real action's in Caracas, not the tax code, and until that mess sorts itself out, the U.S. border's staying busy. Popcorn's ready. This one's too murky for a neat bow. Crime busters or bust. Trump's tariff versus Venezuelan bad guys. Our tariff tale chugs toward its April 2nd, 2025 showdown. Trump's been hyping it as a superhero move to zap Venezuelan crime right out of American streets. Tren de Aragua, those prison-bred troublemakers, are the poster boys for his Maduro's sending us gangsters rant. But here's the million. Question: can a tax on oil buyers really clip the wings of these border-hopping baddies? Spoiler, it's looking less like a knockout punch and more like a swing at a piñata that's already halfway across the room. Let's break it down. This tariff's got its sights on Venezuela's oil trades, mac the government's wallet. By scaring off buyers like China or India with a 25% export tax, fair enough, it might leave Maduro counting pennies instead of barrels. But Tren de Aragua isn't exactly sitting in Caracas's boardrooms, sipping oil profits like champagne. These guys are a gritty street crew. Think drugs, extortion, and human trafficking, funded more by chaos and desperation than by state oil checks. The link between Venezuela's crude cash and their U.S. shenanigans. It's flimsier than a umbrella. Oil money might keep Maduro's regime afloat, but it's not like he's cutting paychecks to gangsters with border chaos division on the memo line. Truth is, Tren de Aragua's U.S. cameos small-time busts in places like Chicago. Or Texas isn't some grand oil-funded invasion. They're piggybacking on the migrant wave, preying on their own people with scams and shakedowns, not rolling in on tankers of black gold. By 2025, their cash flow's more about street hustles than state handouts, and Trump's tariff doesn't touch that. It's like trying to stop a bank robbery by taxing the getaway car's gasher. It's a hassle, but the crooks are still running the heist. If Trump really wanted to zap these gangsters, he'd need a sharper tool. Think beefed-up cops, border stings, or sanctions laser-focused on the gang's ringleader stuff. The FBI and D drool over. The Alien Enemies Act, deportations he's already pushing. That's closer, but it's still a blunt club, not a scalpel. And it's got lawyers screaming louder than a car alarm. The tariff, though, it's aiming at oil rigs, not crime dens, and the dots just don't connect tight enough to make a dent. Studies back this up. Economic pressure on governments rarely kneecaps street-level crooks unless the cash trail's crystal clear, and here it's more like a doodle than a map. So, as April 2nd creeps closer, the tariffs' crime-fighting cred looks shaky. Will it shrink Tren de Aragua's U.S. footprint? Probably not. They're too scrappy, too detached from oil's ups and downs. Maduro might sweat, oil buyers might squirm, but the gangsters, they'll keep hustling, tariff or no tariff. Trump's swinging big, but this time he might have aimed at the wrong villain. The saga rolls on, and the only thing getting busted might be the popcorn budget. The experts weigh in tariff trouble or clever chaos. As Trump's oil tariff barrels toward its April 2nd, 2025, grand entrance, the peanut gallery of experts, economists, policy wonks, and the tie-wearing types who live for spreadsheets hasn't exactly been clapping in unison. Instead, they're raising eyebrows and muttering into their coffee about this secondary tariff stunt. It's not every day you see a tax that doesn't just poke the bad guy, but also jabs his buddies. And the brain trust isn't sure whether to call it genius or a glorified mess. First off, the economic fallout's got them twitchy. Slapping a 25% tariff on countries buying Venezuelan oil sounds bold, but it's like tossing a pebble into a pond. The ripples could splash everyone, including the U.S. These number crunchers point out that oil's a global game. If China or India back off Maduro's crude to dodge the tax, supply tightens, prices nudge up, and suddenly, American drivers are grumbling at $4 a gallon gas again. Businesses might feel it too higher shipping costs, pricier raw materials, the works. One economist probably quipped over a latte, Trump's trying to squeeze Venezuela, but he might end up squeezing our wallets instead. And that's before you get to Venezuela itself, where a deeper economic nosedive could mean more migrants, not fewer Rionic. Given Trump's border beef, then there's the whole secondary tariff vibeless, a traditional jab, and more. A wild swing at the room, experts are side-eyeing its unorthodox flair. Usually tariffs hit the target country straight on. Think steel from China or wine from France. But this, it's like punishing your neighbor's friends for buying his lemonade. Policy nerds call it a cousin to secondary sanctions, a trick the U.S. has pulled on Iran or Russia, but slapping it on oil trade feels like a new twist. It's creative, I'll give him that. One analyst might have smirked, but it's also a Pandora's box. If it works, great, Trump's got a shiny new toy for the foreign policy toolbox. If it flops, it's a precedent for chaos, with every nation eyeballing tit-for-tat taxes. The consensus? A big fat Some experts worry it's less a masterstroke and more a gamble could spike oil prices, annoy allies, and barely nudge Maduro's throne. Others shrugged, figuring it's Trump being Trump, loud, brash, and betting on shock value. Either way, they're not betting the farm on it, fixing immigration, or crime. Those dots still don't connect. As April 2nd looms, the wonks are scribbling notes, sipping espresso, and waiting to see if this tariff's a sleeper hit or just another loud rerun. One thing's for sure, the popcorn's still hot, and the reviews are rolling in. The world bites. Back Venezuela fires the first salvo as Trump's oil tariff plotline hit the global stage. The international cast wasn't about to sit quietly in the audience. First up to grab the mic, Venezuela, naturally, with a response so fiery it could have grilled an arepa. On March 24, 2025, just hours after Trump signed his executive order, the Maduro government unleashed a verbal barrage, branding the secondary tariffs as arbitrary, illegal, and desperate, a triple threat insult that sounded like it was ripped from a courtroom drama. They didn't stop there, accusing the U.S. of stomping all over international trade rules like a bull in a china shop, and vowing to drag this mess to the multilateral courthouse. Maduro himself strutted into the spotlight that night, chest puffed and defiance dialed to 11. "This isn't a sanction, it's an imperial tantrum," he thundered, or something close to it, framing Trump's move as the latest flop in a long line of U.S. attempts to bring Venezuela to its knees. Posts on X echoed the sentiment, with the regime calling it a new aggression and a flagrant violation of global norms. Maduro's not one to mince words. He's built a career on shaking his fist at Washington, and this was peak performance art. They've failed before, and they'll fail again, he sneered. painting Venezuela as the scrappy underdog that just won't quit. Cue the patriotic music. But it wasn't all bluster. The government doubled down with a promise to lawyer up, threatening to haul the U.S. before multilateral bodies think the World Trade Organization, WTO, or maybe the United Nations, though they didn't name names. We'll fight this with every legal tool we've got. The Foreign Ministry huffed in a statement, hinting at a courtroom cage match over trade law. Experts reckon they've got a case. WTO rules frown on discriminatory tariffs, and this punish the friends tactic could raise some legal eyebrows. Whether they'll win is another story. Venezuela's track record in global forums is more spirited rant than slam-dunk victory. But it's a bold swing. Behind the bravado, though, you can almost hear the nervous sweat. Oil's their lifeline, about 660,000 barrels a day exported in 2024, per clear day tanned. This tariff threatens to choke it further. Maduro's defiance might rally the base, but with an economy already on crutches, losing buyers like China or India could sting worse than his words let on. For now, Venezuela's playing the "we shall overcome" card, banking on resilience, and maybe some sneaky oil swaps to weather the storm. As April 2nd looms, the world's watching to see if this is just hot air or the opening shot in a bigger trade war. Rumble. The global chorus. China roars. India and Spain sweet Venezuela. Mitov kicked off the international reaction party with a bang. But they weren't the only ones RSVPing to Trump's tariff invite. As the April 2nd, 2025 deadline loomed like a storm cloud, other nations, especially the oil-buying bigwigs, started chiming in. And let's just say the vibes ranged from heck no to uh-oh, now what? This wasn't just a Caracas tantrum anymore. It was a global gabfest, and everyone had an opinion. China, predictably, wasn't here for the drama, or at least, not Trump's version of it. Beijing came out swinging, slamming the U.S. tariff as a meddling, overreaching intervention in Venezuela's business, illegal and unilateral. Barked Foreign Ministry spokesman Guo Jiakun on March 25th, echoing his sentiment China's been honing since sanctions first hit Caracas years ago. They urged the U.S. to ditch the long-arm jurisdiction stick and let Venezuela breathe. Beijing, always ready to poke Washington with a principled stick. Behind the bluster, though, some Chinese refineries hit the pause button on Venezuelan oil deals. Posts on X buzzed with chatter about the uncertainty. Why risk a 25% tariff slap on their U.S. exports when the oil market's already a circus? Still, don't count China out. Their bromance with Maduro's regime runs deep. 68% of Venezuela's 2023 oil exports went their way, per the U.S. Energy Information Administration. They might grumble, but they're not ditching their buddy just yet. Maybe they'll just get sneakier about it. Meanwhile, over in India, the mood was less fiery and more yikes. This could sting. Companies like Reliance Industries, who'd been happily slurping up Venezuelan crude 254,000 barrels a day in January 2024, nearly half of Venezuela's total exports were now staring down a potential cost hike. Trump's tariff could jack up the price of their U.S.-bound goods, from petrochemicals to textiles, and nobody at Reliance HQ was popping champagne over that. India's imported 22 million barrels from Venezuela in 2024, peanuts at 1.5% of their total crude haul, but it's a sweet deal they'd rather not lose. With U.S. approval secured in 2023 to restart those imports, Reliance might need to pivot fast maybe. Lean harder on Russia or the Middle East, or just eat the extra cost and grumble quietly. Spain's Repsol, too, was feeling the heat. Spanish oil giants been cozy with Venezuela for years, operating there under special licenses even as sanctions tightened. In 2024, they were among the top European buyers, alongside smaller players like Italy. But now, that 25% tariff threat could dent their U.S. export profits. Think chemicals or refined products and force. Some quick math, Repsol's got a U.S. waiver to keep drilling in Venezuela, much like Chevron's freshly extended license. Good till May 27th, courtesy of Trump's Treasury on March 24th. But while Chevron's safe for now, Repsol's sweating the broader fallout. Higher costs or a scramble for new oil sources aren't exactly fiesta material. The global reaction's a mixed bag. China's yelling foul while quietly hedging bets. India's Reliance is eyeing its bottom line, and Spain's Repsol is clutching its licenses like a lifeline. April 2nd's still days away. But the tariffs already stirring, the POTSA might ditch Venezuelan oil. Others might dodge through loopholes, and a few might just shrug and pay up. One thing's clear, Trump's thrown a curveball, and the world's swinging back with everything from defiance to dismay. Popcorn's still popping. This episode's got legs. The refs step in. Trade watchdogs and wonks cry foul with Trump's oil tariff riling up Venezuela, China, and a handful of oil importers. The spotlight's now swinging to the rule keepers of the global trade game international organizations, and the brainy experts who live for trade law footnotes. As April 2nd, 2025, inches closer, these folks aren't just watching from the sidelines. They're blowing whistles and waving yellow flags, wondering if the U.S. just pulled a fast one on the rulebook and what it means for the bigger playground. The World Trade Organization, WTO, hasn't officially ruled yet. Those wheels turn slower than a sloth on vacation, but the chatter's loud. Venezuela's already screaming foul, insisting this secondary tariff breaks the WTO's sacred code. They've got a point to chew on. Under WTO rules, tariffs are supposed to be fair and non-discriminatory. Everyone gets the same deal, unless there's a legit exception like national security. Trump's team might lean on that excuse, yelling tren de Aragua and border chaos to justify it, but experts are skeptical. This isn't a tariff on Venezuela, it's a tariff on everyone else for buying from them. One trade? Lawyer probably mused over a stale croissant at a Geneva cafe. That's a stretch even for the security clause. If Venezuela drags this to a WTO panel, as they've threatened, it could spark a legal slugfest, though. Their odds of winning might hinge more on sympathy than airtight lawyering. Beyond legality, the trade gurus are fretting about the ripple effects. This isn't your grandpa's tariff on steel or Cheez-Its, a funky punish-the-friends move that could rewrite the playbook. The International Chamber of Commerce, ICC, and think tank types are buzzing with what-ifs. What if China retaliates with its own sneaky taxes? What if India or the EU start copying this trick for their own beefs? It's a slippery slope to tariff anarchy. One analyst quipped on X, half joking, half horrified. The WTO's already creaking under U.S.-China trade spats, this. And it might just groan louder, with smaller nations caught in the crossfire. Venezuela's not alone in griping. Trade scholars like those at the Peterson Institute or the Center for Economic Policy research point out the broader mess. Oil prices could jitter, supply chains could snarl, and the U.S. might lose some moral high ground in preaching free trade. It's bold, but it's bonkers. One expert might have chuckled, scribbling notes for a future TED Talk. They're not saying it's doomed, just that it's a gamble with more loose ends than a thrift store sweater. If it sticks, Trump's got a new toy. If it flops, it's a cautionary tale for the textbooks. So, while Maduro rants and China fumes, the trade world's clutching its rulebooks, debating if this tariff's a clever hack or a legal oopsie. April 2nd's the kickoff, but the real fireworks might be in Geneva, not Washington. For now, the experts are hedging bets, sipping tea, and watching the chaos unfold, because in this saga, even the refs can't call the game yet. The grand finale. Trump's tariff, tail symbol or stumble. And so, our Trump tariff telenovela reaches its curtain call with the stage set for April 2nd, 2025, and the world's still buzzing like it's finale night. Officially, this oil tax saga kicked off as a noble quest. Slap a 25% tariff on Venezuela's oil buyers to twist Maduro's arm over immigration chaos and Tren de Aragua's gangster antics spilling into the U.S., but peel back the script. And it's clear this was more than a border brawl, it was a political blockbuster, starring Trump as the tough-and-crime sheriff, with cameos from domestic flexing, a Maduro take-on, and a sly wink at China's geopolitical dance card. Hitch. The plot's got more holes than a Mothaton sweater, and the reviews are mixed at best. Let's rewind the highlights. At home, Trump sold this to his base like a rally anthem: hardline borders, safe streets, America first vibes. Abroad, it was a double whammy. Kneecap Maduro's oil cash to spark a regime wobble and poke China in the ribs while they're sipping Venezuelan crude. Bold, sure, but effective. That's where the credits start to blur. Venezuelans aren't fleeing because of oil deals. They're running from an economy where a loaf of bread costs a suitcase of a government that loves a good crackdown, and a life where hope is just a word in old songs. This tariff might shrink Maduro's wallet, but it's not fixing hyperinflation or handing out food. If anything, it could nudge more folks out the door, ironic for a plan pitched as a migration stopper. Then there's the crime Angletren de Araguas U.S. tour. Sounds scary, but the tariff's aim feels off-target. These guys aren't bankrolled by oil rigs. They're street hustlers thriving on chaos, not state checks. Want to bust them? Cops and sanctions on their ringleaders might do the trick. But taxing oil buyers is like mopping the floor in a rainstorm essay and missing the point. Experts scratched their heads, trade buffs waved rulebooks, and the numbers just didn't add up. Immigration still surging, crime still scrappy. Mission accomplished. More like mission muddled. The world didn't exactly clap either. Maduro roared illegal and desperate. A tantrum with a side of legal threats while China thundered about U.S. meddling, even as their refineries blinked nervously. India and Spain's oil giants like Reliance and Repsol braced for cost hikes, and trade watchdogs muttered about WTO fouls. It's a global chorus of really America. With Venezuela's economy teetering closer to the abyss and diplomatic feathers thoroughly ruffled. Sure, it's a loud statement. Trump loves a megaphone butt as a fix for the problems it claims to tackle. It's more sizzle than steak. In the end, this tariff's less a silver bullet and more a shiny Symbiola chest-thumping flex that might bruise Venezuela, irk China, and rally the base but won't rewrite the migration or crime script. It risks turning Caracas into an even bleaker ghost town and the UN into a louder complaint box, all while the root causes fester. As April 2nd dawns, the saga closes not with a bang, but a hum, a tale of big swings, bigger noise, and a legacy that's more meme than miracle. The popcorn's gone, the lights are up, and the world's left wondering, was it worth the hype? Time and maybe a WTO gavel will tell? So that wraps up our look at the U.S. tariffs on Venezuelan oil and the reasons behind this decision. We hope you found this story informative and helpful for your English learning journey. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to share it with anyone else who might find it interesting or useful. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Story Driven English for more engaging stories and English lessons. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about this situation? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.